Right, well, welcome everybody. It's great to see so many people joining us this evening for this online launch of Sylvia Pankhurst, A Natural Born Rebel by Rachel Holmes, published by Bloomsbury. I'm Marianne Jump, I'm the archivist and librarian at the Marx Memorial Library. Unfortunately, I'm not actually there at the moment, despite my backdrop, but we are really pleased to be virtually hosting this launch this evening. Before I introduce our speakers, just start with a little bit of housekeeping. I'm recording this event so that we can upload it to our website for future reference, so I hope that's okay with everybody here. Our plan is for a kind of in-conversation event. We've got Professor Mary Davis and Rachel Holmes both here for a nice chat, but then there will be time for a Q&A. So what we're going to be asking you to do is please do put any questions that you have for our speakers, particularly Rachel and her book, in the chat during the course as they come to you in the course of the event, and we've got some MML people lurking in the chat who'll be picking up on those and responding to any other questions that you have. So please do that. And yeah, as I've said, please do keep your microphones off. That makes it easier for everybody else with the audio. I'm going to be a bit cheeky as host and just say a little bit about the Marx Memorial Library and why we're so pleased to be hosting this virtual event this evening. As many of you know, we're a library, an archive and an education charity. We were founded in 1933 in response to the burning of books in Nazi Germany, in response to the rise of fascism in Europe. And we have a fantastic collection on Marxism and the history of socialism, and a very broad-reaching program, education program as well, which touches on all of these subjects, drawing on our collections and expertise. Can people hear me okay? I've been told my volume's low. Oh, good, okay. So that's a bit about us, and during the course of the event we'll also be putting some URLs, so please do check out our future events. This is the first of our term's events, as it were, in 2021. We've got quite a few others coming up. We've got another book launch tomorrow, for example, and we've got a course on an introduction to Marxism coming up, as well as lots of other things. So please do take a look at our website. We would have loved to hold this event, obviously, at the Marx Memorial Library itself, although I don't think we'd fit you all in. I think now we've got 90 people signed in. But I think there couldn't be a more appropriate venue, to be honest. We have, as I've just said, a rich collection on Marxism, also on Marxist feminism and on movements for colonial freedom. So we think this is utterly appropriate for this evening's event. Indeed, we hold many articles and pamphlets authored by Sylvia herself, including on Ethiopia, for example, and we have copies of the journal Votes for Women, including articles and drawings by Sylvia herself on the treatment of political prisoners and on poverty in the East End of London, for example, just to name a few things covered by our collections. Not only that, but anyone who's visited us in recent years will know that we also have pride of place in our reading room, a maquette, a small statue of Sylvia Pankhurst by sculptor Ian Walters, which is on loan to us from the Sylvia Pankhurst Memorial Committee, who have a long-standing campaign, which is now coming to fruition, to get a statue, I think an 8-foot version of this lovely kind of dynamic statue of Sylvia erected on Clerkenwell Green, which we think is very appropriate given the radical history of the area. And I understand that this is progressing well, so we're delighted with news of that, and we do look forward to working on lots of engagement work around the erection of the statue in due course. Right, well, we also couldn't be happier to welcome author biographer Rachel Holmes, who's a long-standing friend of the Marx Memorial Library, to unveil this fantastic work. We were just discussing how, actually before my time, so about over 5.5 years ago, Rachel launched her biography of Eleanor Marx at the library, and there was kind of standing room only, I understand. But my very fond memory of my kind of first year as a librarian at the MML was Rachel coming along to host an event to unveil a poster we'd recently had preserved listing Eleanor Marx as a speaker at a kind of commemorative event for the Paris Commune, and with a plaque and a lovely portrait which still hangs pride of place on our staircase. And whenever we have visitors round on our tours, we're always saying Rachel's book on Eleanor is an absolute must. It's incredibly evocative mix of the personal and the political. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this new work this evening. We're also delighted to have Professor Mary Davis, who was ideally placed to have this discussion with Rachel this evening, who is not only the library's Secretary of Trustees, but also historian and author of Sylvia Pankhurst, A Life in Radical Politics, published by Pluto Press. So I think that is definitely enough from me. So I'm going to hand over now to Mary and Rachel.
Right, thank you very much. Rachel Holmes, this is a tour de force and a magnum opus. And it's such a magnum opus that one can hardly lift it. It's over 1,000 pages long, but it's well worth it. And given that I personally am not very much in favour of biographies, I found this absolutely riveting, probably because I was utterly put off by Patricia Romero's dreadful biography of Sylvia Pankhurst. This stands no comparison whatsoever. It is fantastic. And at some point, I'm going to ask you about the nature of biography, because you made some wonderful comments in the book about that. But first of all, really, it's over to you. I want to know two things. Why your interest in Sylvia, and why you thought that such an extensive biography was important.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mary, for that more than generous introduction. And it's great to be back, albeit virtually, at the Marx Memorial Library for what I feel like is an at-home book launch for Sylvia, who's very much a sequel to Eleanor Marx, and wherein lies part of my answer to the first of your two questions. Before I do go on, I just want to say to you, Mary, and to everyone else who sort of gathered for this congregation at this time, this disastrous pandemic in Britain, and everybody I know has loved ones who are ill, has bereavements, and has a great deal of difficulty at the moment. I'm sure there's probably not anybody on this Zoom at the moment who's not experiencing that, and I just want to acknowledge that and say all the more how good it is to just get together and to think about Sylvia's legacy in this context, and people to give the time to it. So your two questions, Mary, sort of why another Sylvia now, and why so extensive, and somewhat counterintuitively, this might amuse you, I'm not sure that I'm entirely sure about the genre of biography either, which might be partly why I engage with it. Certainly not in the sense of the idea of the grand narrative of the single transformative individual, which I fundamentally do not believe in. But I think that people experience biography in the way that if we engage in a single life, we engage in the life lived in history. And I'm interested in what the river looks like from the perspective of the fish, not the person standing on the bank, sort of looking at the bird's eye grand narrative of history. So what does it look like if you're swimming in the river? What does it look like if you're on the street? But also because of the very presumptive nonsense of that idea of the single transformative individual, that people are made up of villages and movements. I mean, I grew up in South Africa, and there's a very, very common saying in KwaZulu-Natal, where I come from, and indeed many other parts of the African continent, you know, it takes a village to bring up a child, and there are variations of that in different ways. So biography is never about one person, it's about many people, and it is about a way of, I think, sort of entering into the ebb and flow of movements, and seeing how people can go along through in them, and then how the life lived is always and often inconsistent. That interests me, with ideals, with impetus, with desires, and in Sylvia's case, you know, with visions and principles, and how those things rub up against each other in the nitty-gritty of real world activism and politics, and indeed the inconsistency of being human. I do equally at the same time feel that we lack in not, I hasten to say, in any way rigorously in an academic context or in a political context, certainly not in rigorous and collective histories of the left, but in an idea of a sort of, for want of a what's called sort of, if you like, trade publishing or popular history or whatever, a kind of a consistent intellectual history of women in the left. And that brings me to Sylvia specifically. And to me, she takes up literally where Eleanor Marx left off. There's a handing over, and I in terms of being able to trace a socialist feminist history, which is both at the one hand of activism and engagement, whether it's with trade unions, whether it's with politics and the parliamentary processes, but also an engagement as writers, as editors, as journalists and thinkers. And there is, in the beginning of my book, as you know, I tell a story of 1896 when Eleanor Marx, I guess she must have been about 41 by then, is at the Moseley Hotel in Manchester with at an event in honour of William Liebknecht, who she's known all her life. And Richard Pankhurst of Manchester, barrister, Republican, known as the Red Doctor or Pankhurstski, and took his 13-year-old daughter Sylvia to this meeting. And Sylvia was greatly impressed by Eleanor Marx, then at the height of her powers, and equally interested and impressed by how she took up the space, how she spoke, the unfussy nature of her dress. All these things impressed her. Significantly less impressed by Edward Aveling, her partner, and actually made a rather sort of snarky remark about him. But it's an interesting one that really captured me, because what's very interesting about Sylvia is that her life, and this comes to the second point about the capaciousness and the length and size of the book, it's a very long life. I mean, she lives and she becomes, as you know, having, you know, written about her yourself, and indeed I build on your work fundamentally in, you know, that's a foundation. I couldn't have done the book without it, although, as you quite rightly say, we can all do without Patricia Romero, you know. But therein lies a you know, another tale. Very prosaically, Eleanor Marx never escapes try as she might, she cannot escape a kind of tragic victimhood, and her life is cut untimely short. And Sylvia, on the other hand, dies contented and peaceful, and still in harness, working of her own volition in her bed in Addis, you know, having lived and worked from sort of the age of 9 or 10 to, you know, to her late 70s. And she's not she overcomes so many of those things that hamper all of us, women of all, you know, women and men, but women in particular, and political women, activist women. And that, for me, that moment where on the one hand there is the understanding that this is a political inheritance, there's the recognition of the one hand of they're not two hands, but the socialism and the feminism integrated in Eleanor Marx as they were. This is precisely how Sylvia is. And as I argue, and indeed as you do too, that she continues with that. It doesn't sort of suddenly go away because she's not being a suffragette in her youth. This is a neoliberal feminist position, which is nonsense, of course, as we know. Her feminism transforms, and she's engaged with it throughout her life. But she lives, and she lives long, and she lives through so many of these different epochs. And we think of her often as very much defined, because she's a Pankhurst, by the suffragette movement, by being a young militant suffragette. In fact, she has a very long career after the 20s that stretches through, and as Marianne alluded to in her introduction, and indeed as the holdings of the library reflect, her anti-fascism, her anti-imperialism, her anti-colonialism. Then there is also her campaigning for health, maternal health, so many other things. And for me in particular, the question or the positioning of the importance of her engagement as an anti-racist, and how she evolves from something which is quite common even in 19th century liberal contexts in Britain, but when I say, you know, political liberalism, but very much obviously in terms of radicalism, which is abolitionism and anti-slavery. But she moves right through and up to an engagement with Pan-Africanism, the African Renaissance, an understanding of Africanist consciousness, and engagement with people, and think about it. She's parallel in her life and engagement with this in Britain in the 1920s, when the young Malcolm X is having a parallel, obviously a different background, but he's also somebody who's transformed by prison experience. She engages with, for example, just one example, W.E. Du Bois, and the exchangement of that. Her travels in America when she goes to Fisk University, where the NAACP say to her, please don't cancel talks speaking to Black audiences, when white feminist organizations are saying to her, we don't want you to do that. And she does it. And that then follows right through to later in her life, where she engages in the anti-apartheid movement, of course, having early on been aware of the situation in South Africa from Keir Hardie, her great love, who, as you know, Mary, was the first person ever to stand up in the British Parliament and declare South Africa a racist state. And as you can tell from the length of my answer, the book ends up 1,000 pages, and she is an activist. But she is a person of deeds and words, and there is a whole. She's an activist. There's a whole literary. There are literary works to be written about her, and you and I have discussed the poetry alone. But she's a newspaper editor. She's always publishing newspapers throughout her life. She writes great big fat books, almost as big as and bigger than this one, and considerably faster, I should have to say. So there are so many layers and different facets that it becomes inevitable. Well, it's not inevitable. In what I was trying to do to bring those things together, but I think also, and this is where I will sort of put a puncture. We'll just sort of come to the end of that on the second question. I mean, the why now is because our rights and freedoms are fundamentally under threat, and here is somebody who worked really hard for them throughout her life, but was part of, it's not just her, it's a reminder of all that work that went into achieving the rights and freedoms that we have and that are under attack. And so that's on the one hand, but I think that on the other hand, it's or tied with that is that it's a way of trying to bring into dialogue the way that all those struggles are part of the same. And you can call it intersectionality now. People have different ways of languages and different forms of how these things are structured, but in effect what I'm trying to say is that there's no way that they're separate. They're all part of a single and continuous struggle for equality, freedom, rights and justice.
Well, I think it's wonderful that you made the connection between Eleanor Marx and Sylvia. It's also wonderful that you did bring out really the main, well, I mean, I didn't write a biography, I just said life and radical politics of feminism, socialism, anti-racism and anti-imperialism, which you absolutely place perfectly, and I completely agree with every word. But there's right at the end, you quote Gerald Martin about biographies, and you said that people's lives are in three categories: the public, the private, and the secret lives. And the public is the business of biography. The private is what you say, is what Sylvia Pankhurst herself decided that she wanted to be written about. I mean, she wrote such a lot, as you know. I mean, I can't, in fact, you've revealed much more than I even knew about. I find it amazing. And then the secret life, which you say that you felt that you did have a right to go into because of Richard Pankhurst, Sylvia's son, did give you some letters. And this is the relationship. I don't want you necessarily to talk about it massively, but it's something that I have been denying forever until I read what you wrote. And that is her relationship with Keir Hardie. And now you know that the horrible biographer that I mentioned, Patricia Romero, talked about her having this kind of, the great man thing was her father, Keir Hardie, and then Haile Selassie, that she couldn't be accounted for. Anyway, let's forget about her. But I've always I've never seen the documentary evidence about what obviously was a massive love affair with Keir Hardie, and actually you deal with it very sensitively. But this was new to me because I'd always wanted to deny it, just because everybody, you know how it is. People say, "Oh, behind every woman there's a man," sort of thing, and she couldn't have done it without blah blah blah. So you do go into the private, and but you do it very sensitively. And I think also the way in which and this is what I would like you to talk about a little bit more, is the relationship. The relationship with Haile Selassie, which of course, as we know, he was a benevolent despot. But I think quite rightly, don't castigate her for criticizing him because of his position. Ethiopia being the only independent African country, and actually that's where I think she met Mandela first, was in Ethiopia, wasn't it? Because Haile Selassie gave, African nationalists could come to Ethiopia. I think the stuff that, and this is what if you'd like to say a little bit more about it, you for the first time, I think, have uncovered a huge amount of her work on Ethiopia, and particularly the time that she lived there for the last 4 years of her life. So could you say something about her Pan-Africanism and Ethiopia? We know that she edited the New Times and Ethiopian News, but it was much more than that, wasn't it? And her actual life in Ethiopia as well. Perhaps you could, because this is all brilliant new stuff that I think is just fantastic.
Well, thank you, Mary. And the route in, I mean, the roots into how she, how she ends up in Ethiopia. Again, it's those confluences of the one hand of coming from an abolitionist Mancunian background, but more generally, you know, I think the abolitionism is important because the prevalence of racism and indeed anti-Semitism, both of which, like Eleanor Marx, she fought against in the unions, was something that she came to be very defined in the 1920s. So it was partly by that, but it was also because of Mussolini's intentions in imperialism in Ethiopia that began that what became literally that journey towards where she ended up, she was in her first experience of Mussolini, of what was coming, was when she went to a socialist conference in Bologna. I think it was 1919, you know, they were beaten up by black shirts going into a meeting, and then of course she has a partner after Keir Hardie's death, Silvio Corio, who is an Italian anarcho-syndicalist, I suppose one might say. Through that, these things come together. Before we get to Addis, I think what's really was interesting for me, and also very familiar perhaps to all of us, is how her encounter with the African diaspora begins in London. Because there are many people from different parts of the world who are either in exile, being educated, passing through London. And at this time, she's in Woodford in Essex. And indeed, a young Kwame Nkrumah, who, of course, you know, later becomes the great leader of Ghana, said to Sylvia when he met her years later in Addis, and he said, "How are things in the village?" And of course, that is, you know, the African expression for, like, you know, the place that's happening, you know, the collective, the town. But for he, as a youngster, went to Woodford, where many different people, Egyptians, South Africans, Ethiopians, you know, Kenyans, people from various different, well, it was actually Kenyatta, rather. I mean, so there are many different people congregated there. And indeed, she was friends with Amy Ashworth Garvey, and we've already mentioned Du Bois and so on. So through that, and the beginning of her familiarity through that diaspora, which also is about music and culture, and the culture aspect is really important, because I really would like, if we have a chance, to talk about how I think that something, you know, in the other 1,000-page volume, which I won't write, but maybe somebody else was, just so what Sylvia's understanding and recognition of the significance of Ethiopian art, and those relationships between Coptic art and those angels that, you know, we go right back to her suffragette angels, but I can remember standing in front of those Coptic angels, both in Cairo, of course, where they originally came from, and then in Addis, and being able to see that from her point of view, how that history, she'd studied up to the Renaissance when she was in Britain, but she then understood all of that came behind it for so many thousands of years. And I think her beautiful book, I don't talk enough about it in my own, or write enough about it in her book about Ethiopian art and history and culture, is just phenomenal in terms of her capturing that. And this is no mean thing, because she did a BBC TV program, the early television program, laying out and showing Ethiopian art objects and art and glassware and so on, at a time when, you know, people like the racist Evelyn Waugh were kind of literally saying, you know, Hottentot barbarians, you know, that this kind of idea that there was no culture, and that, you know, Mussolini's civilizing influence and fascism was a jolly good thing. And it's easy to forget the significance of showing that and putting that in the context. And yes, as you say, she knows, of course, and works on behalf of and with Haile Selassie, and I think more importantly, young Ethiopians who were exiled. And yes, many of them were of good family. Some of them were, children of feudal lords, or of people who had who were participating in the resistance, and who were fighting. But all of them came from traumatized and dislocated families. Many of them had been injured, and they were coming to study and to build a new generation, a new cadre who would be able to then go and try and develop new democratic structures and inherit what the process that Haile Selassie started inevitably would lead to his demise. And I think one of the things that I find interesting about her is that I think Sylvia really relates to those youngsters, in that case, these young Ethiopians, as it's not a race thing. It's like she understands that they are some middle-class kids who've had opportunities of study and learning, and they want to learn how to organize, and they want to learn how to do stuff so that they can, so it's an idea of that sort of responsibility. She is a critical friend of Selassie right from the beginning. And there's the first time they meet, and she says it in her way, and knowing her, you can imagine her, you can imagine her saying it. And she says, I want to make quite clear that I am a Republican, and I do not, I do not support monarchies in any forms, but I support your cause because it's a just one against fascism. And because there is an intention to move towards democracy, and the story goes that Selassie sort of very quietly said, "Yes, I know." And I do think also it's important to put it in the context, and this is not to be an apologist, at all, for the things that came, but we have to understand the period in which that happens. She dies in 1960, and so the Ethiopia and the Selassie that she knows are of that period. That said, there was a point at which I did make a very clear decision about which side of this history I was going to come down on, and I think that it is impossible to underestimate the importance of the congregation. And you mentioned the South African socialists and liberation nationalist movements, people who congregated, Mandela, who indeed was given a passport by the Ethiopians, and who talks about, he says, I don't want to go to France, I don't want to go to any of these other places that we're supposed to, it was Ethiopia I wanted to go to. That was the place where I understood that I could discover about ideas about sort of African culture and freedom. And it wasn't just that it was a continental hub, but it was an international hub, that people were coming through from America, from other parts of the world. And I think that, as we've seen in terms of Black Lives Matter, for really terrible reasons, the resurgence of that discourse over the last year. Of course, we know that Black Lives Matter is a reiteration of a much longer movement which began before and was reiterated with the anti-slavery and the abolitionist movement. That the paucity of our education, of understanding, that the flowering actually, and how Ethiopia was an intellectual and political center, are really, really important. And actually, I go back to Malcolm X, who we were just discussing earlier. But as to Sylvia in Ethiopia, I suppose for those who may not have come across that part of her career, I suppose one of the things would be to say, and obviously it's all in the book, is that she engages many of the, even though she's older when she's over there, but you wouldn't know it, but she engages a lot of the organising and techniques and things that she was doing with the elves in East London way back then, you know, at the beginning of the century. And I think that my way into that was to look very closely at, as you mentioned, at Richard's work, and also Rita Pankhurst. Rita Pankhurst is a really important repository of that. But I go on. I think the context of her in Ethiopia, and when I tell you, Mary, that again, I had to cut vast swathes from that. And even her, what I call her sort of journalistic safaris, you know, her travels around Ethiopia, and yeah, she goes on great escarpments and she looks at this, that, and the other. But you know, going to the cement factories and going to the coffee factories and looking at the production of sugar and describing how all that works, fascinating.
No, absolutely. I'm very aware that probably people in the audience would think more about Sylvia, about, you know, in terms of the fight for the right to vote, for women's votes, and the suffrage movement, the relationship between her mother and sister, and so on. But the thing is, it's actually what your book shows is that is quite a small fraction of her life. You know, obviously the feminism runs all the way through it, but the thing that the thing that she's known for, of course, almost everywhere, although not nearly enough, because the suffragette movement is really always written in terms of Emmeline and Christabel, which is why we had to rescue Sylvia, didn't we? And that's why we want the statue. That's why all of these things were important. We found that, as you put it, a socialist feminist, you know, doesn't get the due justice. So the reason that I'd ask you about the bits that are unknown is because I'm sure that there are more bits that are known, and I didn't want to slide over that, because your book actually does cover the whole lot. And you call her a natural born rebel. I'm not sure exactly what I understand by that title, but what I feel throughout this is that you, like Vanessa Redgrave, who's quoted on your front cover, so that you fall in love with Sylvia Pankhurst. And what I found that reading your book, that it was utterly incredible that somebody could have done so much in her life. And when you say that it had to be a long book, well, I can see why now, actually. I frankly, I wondered if you wanted to pick out what you think are the most important bits, or the bits that people should know much more about. Because this, and when I say it's a magnum opus, it really is. And the life itself is, it actually makes you feel quite insignificant and small and stupid when you see that there's a woman there who did so much. Every single moment of her life must have been taken up with writing, voluminous writing. But anyway, over to you. What out of all this massive, we haven't covered a millimetre of it actually, what do you find the most impressive, or the most, or what you think people should know more about?
Well, actually, Mary, exactly that. That she doesn't give up, and what is, I mean, that you know, we talk about momentum in different contexts. We talk about movements, but you know, these are they're not objects. I mean, they're verbs. They're doingness, and for me, if I jump into that, I mean, there are so many things coming to the surface. For example, I was really fascinated to discover accidentally so much more about her time in Soviet Russia, and also the journey back. And I think that there's a whole, there's a secluded hidden history, which, as you know, is still there. That there is quite a good deal of stuff that Sylvia never puts into writing, and is clandestine. So just discovering some of that. I think her physical and mental toughness and endurance, A friend of mine said to me a couple of weeks ago, was telling me that they'd had their first COVID test, and that, you know, as they were sitting there with the, you know, the large pipe cleaner out their nose, were thinking, I'm really finding this uncomfortable. And Sylvia Pankhurst was force fed.
Yeah.
You know, and what a wimp am I?
Yeah.
And that bit we know, as you say, that bit we know. But the you know, she walked over mountains. She travelled in very rickety little boats in the, you know, nearly drowned in the Arctic Circle, trying to get to getting to and back from Russia, travelling, of course, without a passport. So there's a sense of I think it's her capacity, her resilience, her keeping goingness, and what drives that. So for me, and that's not, so I'm answering your question, which is, I suppose, not about the specific instances, although there are so many of things to discover. I think the extent of her Europeanness, for me, her internationalism, how important her travels in France, particularly in Italy, particularly her work, you know, with socialists and comrades all over, and her connections with America. Another aspect which I found really interesting, and which I would really love to have longer discussions and engage everybody with, is her relationships with the IWW, and actually I think that there has been one thing I definitely found looking at the America stuff, is that there's been a little bit of a sort of perhaps not looking too closely at that side of but I think you can see some very logical relationships coming through there, and so interesting relationship, always complicated, of course, to forms of workerism and so on, and the ways that she makes those shifts. This is really a book about, it's really a book about change in a way. I mean, she's consistent, but it's also about, I look at those moments of change. So for example, for me, and again, you know, in terms of engagement with your work, really important is how she moves through that process of anti-parliamentarianism, and what, you know, what that means, having literally been there, you know, the first time that the Labour MPs, including her lover Keir Hardie, were, you know, getting into Parliament, and but how she engages and moves through those political times. I think that what I've just answered, the answer I've just given to your really good question, is wholly inadequate, and all I can say is that the answer really is what I've tried to do in the book. The toilet papers, working through those transcripts and working out, and I know we've talked about this before, working out what really the process of the construction of the poems written on cold slate was.
Well, there are some questions, but there's which we're going to come to in a moment. But I think there's some lovely new bits. I mean, for example, you looked at the Home Office papers about her stay in prison, and which was quite new, and the way she was observed and so on, and the lasting impact that had on her health. Christabel, of course, didn't ever have to suffer that, as you've pointed out.
Probably more than once, to be fair. Yes.
Yes. And I mean, also, I don't want to be too psychologistic about this, but I mean, Emily, what a horrible woman she was. What a nasty mother. Anyway, I also didn't know that there was a New Times bookshop in Farringdon, right near the library. That was a nice.
They used to have book events that she had, and that I found so interesting, that they kind of, you know, used to do that they were doing what we do, which was sort of, you know, having book events, and some of the really interesting books on Africa, and again, you know, African writers, American writers who were sort of launched there. Yeah, I found that fascinating. It was bombed, wasn't it? If I remember, that was why that one came to an end.
Sorry, that was my daughter giving me a result of a COVID test. Anyway, what I don't want to. I'd love to hear you talk much more, but I know there's some questions. But just two things that I think are, I don't know about missing, but one thing that I'm surprised. Maybe there is no record of this at all. What was her attitude? She was in England during the general strike, 1926. Can't see anything about that. Also, just you I think at some point you say that what we need to memorialise, or not memorialise, whatever you want to think, yes, memorialise. Maybe we need the collected works of Sylvia Pankhurst, which I think could probably fill several library shelves, probably a library actually. But also we need a memorial. I'm not going to let anybody go without just following up on what Marion said about our statue, which actually I think you could have made a little bit more plug for in the book, and because we're still trying to get this blinking statue. We've been campaigning for 20 years. I mean, literally 20 years. So I want to just maybe just to round this off before the questions, to say that to ask you whether you change your mind about anything to do with Sylvia Pankhurst in the course of writing this book. It does seem a love affair to me, and I completely understand it. But maybe something. Maybe you had those opinions before, and the writing of the book confirmed them, or, well, you tell me. How did it change your perceptions or embed them?
That's really, really interesting, because no, I didn't. That's I started out feeling much more ambivalent about her. I mean, absolutely committed and interested to, of course, to write. You know, one doesn't have to like people to you know, historical figures to write about them, of course. And I did end up progressively liking her a great deal and a great deal more, while simultaneously also, you know, disagreeing with her on a lot of things and finding her infuriating. I didn't feel it was a love affair. That's interesting. I mean, I think Eleanor Marx was quite easily lovable, and that was people's experience of her. I mean, you know, it's pretty hard to find people, apart from the most obvious kind of political enemies, who wouldn't you know, who responded to her in that way, and there were many aspects. I mean, Sylvia didn't have the party, you know, for want of a better way of putting it, the sort of the sort of bon viveurishness that Eleanor Marx did, and that's part of, you know, her prodigious output is, you know, she doesn't, at least working on Eleanor Marx, you know, you'd get pause for the hangover and, you know, or the bit of a holiday and so on. You don't get any of that with Sylvia. So in short, I found that I ended up, liking her more than I did when I started out. And that surprised me. And I think I came to it was very clear engaging closely with the material, particularly on the question of that you, the point that you make about Keir Hardie, that relationship. What's really interesting engaging up close is because you kind of think, okay, she's known him since she was 12, he's a family friend, you know, he's 26 years older and so on. So, you know, what's occurring here, and what's really, really clear from everybody who writes about it, including and most particularly the feminist analysis, is that this idea of, you know, his influence on her, but what about her influence on him? And that comes through so clearly, and her refusal to stand down and her willingness to take him on, to argue with him about things and go off in opposite directions and have a row and put the politics first.
And he was a bit of an old dog, wasn't he?
Well, yeah, but really, I mean, you know, he was her older, but unlike Eleanor Marx, when she knew she wasn't going to get what she wanted from him, she was the one that walked away.
That's true. Absolutely right.
She walked away, and then she had other relationships. A relationship which needs working on more is her relationship with Zélie Emerson. We need to know more about that. There are some things coming to light but you can only substantively, you can only write what you find. I think there's a lot of guilt from Sylvia about that relationship with Celia and what happens there. So there's more work to be done there. And then how those experiences that she's had inform her relationship with Silvio Corio and what she wants out of it. I think I found one thing I did find is that I think she probably was quite a difficult mother. I was thinking about what you said about Emmeline. Not to people who were not Richard. She was a great, insofar as a person can be a mother or a mother figure, and that can be, spread in so many different ways. And yet, looking at that up close, it's just very, very interesting, because how he writes about it, Richard Pankhurst, how he writes about it, and how he stands quite firm. And that was a very, very particular thing. And I was very interested in that relationship between Rita, and I think that also became Rita Pankhurst. That became a whole other aspect to her that opened up in terms of how those relationships informed each other. If it is a love affair, then I must be quite a critical and difficult person to have a love affair with, because there's plenty of things I feel I sort of haul her up on, and so on. But in short, I do, and I do end up liking her, I have to say.
Well, that's not the whole purpose of the book, because the book just stands as an absolutely phenomenal political biography and covers the things that we should all, and I think you end up saying this, all of the things that we should be concerned about today, she was concerned about. She would be fighting on so many of the issues that we're fighting on. They haven't gone away. That's why we do just that directly, not just to honour her. It's the issues that she. But I'm gonna there's some questions in the chat, and I think we must have a look at them first, or you must. I'm not going to answer them. It's all to you. Right. So one of the questions, I'm going to give you two or three at the time. One question asks whether what your view is of her history, Sylvia's history of the suffragette movement. And I know you write quite a bit about that. I think, and then another one. Yes, somebody asked. Well, it says you haven't mentioned anything about her somewhat fraught relationship with the Communist Party. Could you?
It's in the book.
Shed some light on that? So that Communist Party, and then another one is a question of how important art was for Sylvia. Well, yes. Oh God, that will take you a long time. Another book, I think. And okay, can I just one more? Somebody's obviously read it, because she's saying Fiona Bloomer says the book is astounding in its detail, but she wants you to talk a bit more about her work during World War I with the East End community. Okay.
Thank you. Well, thank you for all those questions. Unlike, and I agree with you, Mary, and there's more to that, but unlike the coverage of the general strike, 1926, actually all the other questions arising are covered, and quite extensively, in the book. And indeed, I'll take them in turn briefly. The suffragette movement is incredibly important, and one of the things that I do in the book is that I try and have a framing device, if you like, which is Sylvia was a great memorialist and autobiographer, and that is a very interesting and challenging aspect of writing about her, particularly in a biographical form. And what I tried to do was to look at the significant thing about the suffragette movement for me is that, and I write this in the book, that she writes it in 1933 with her young son nursing in a cradle next to her firstborn child, who she's had at the age of 45, which was, you know, it's still something to be commented on now and was all the more remarkable then. And I'm interested in how she is going back to tell that history of her childhood and the suffragette movement of the title, which, as Mary says, is what she's best known for, but that not to forget that she's doing it from the perspective of being a new mother in 1933. And the answer to that, I mean, I think the suffragette movement is an incredibly interesting and great book. It's partisan, of course, you know, Sylvia is. And one of the things from a purely historical and biographical point of view is it's great to be able to read it because it gives you all sorts of things to test, because she's very persuasive. You know, you can read it and you can think, yes, I believe that. But then you go away and you check it and you say, well, is that exactly what was going on and who said what, and the kind of self-editing that goes on. So that's very helpful and constructive. Always important to remember with that book that she wrote The Suffragette in 1911, which is a great big fat book, which was the sort of history that the WSPU had asked her to write and is endorsed and prefaced by her mother. And there's nothing personal in it at all. It is a history and an account of you know, there's literally 2 lines that make any referral to anything personal. When she revisits this, therefore, in 1933, the interesting thing for me about the suffragette movement, and perhaps for you, and this is what drives your question, is how she makes a decision to write something which is personal and political, and that it's a very conscious, it's done very, very consciously, and it's very revealing, including of her relationship with Keir Hardie. I think that is framing, and equally, if you then take the home front, which is the subsequent one, you can sort of do things there. But I always think that it would be an easier thing to do novelistically, perhaps cinematically, but there's nothing that says you can't do it in history. The very fact of it is that I hope as readers that it's possible to, and I bring it to the front to keep in view that it's a bifurcation, and to understand that that she's writing, you know, retrospectively, and what we learn in that gap. And most particularly, Mary, coming back to your point about motherhood, that she's reflecting on her mother and other mothers in that history precisely at the moment where she is there as this new mother, struggling, as she says, for the first time to write. She said, the words used to pour out of me, and now I'm really struggling, and I can only grab, you know, half an hour because I need to nurse Richard, and so on and so on. The fraught relationship with the CP is covered in the book. Whether you, I'm sorry, I didn't get the name of the person who asked the question. Pauline. But whether you will find it in sufficient detail, you know, I'll have to leave to your discretion. There is always, of course, as with any factionalism and any schisms, one has to be selective, but I hope that the broad outlines and some detail will satisfy you, and to explain how, you know, it got to that point, you know, traveling through Lenin and then finally right down to the end of her parting company. As to art, I open the book, and I think that Sylvia, I call the first section or the second section Decalogue Dilemma, because she had this, that she was an extraordinary artist, and she could have done that alone and it would have been enough. She certainly, and this goes back to your question, I think, about how I feel about her, Mary, or how I like her, is that I'd say, you know, right at the beginning, she was by nature an artist, yet she became one of the great unsung political figures of the 20th century. And as much as I can, I try and track that art. And she, you know, she got a scholarship to the Manchester School of Art, which was a really radical, and they put up a plaque, by the way, for her last year for the first time, a bit late, but they have done it. And she went to the Manchester School of Art, and then she won a national exhibition to the Royal College of Art, and her installations. I mean, the work that she did on I think of her as Blakean in a sense, and vision, and she has that sort of vision and the idea of the great public art, but also, as we know, the significance and importance of those of the so-called Northern Tour that she did, and that the work that she did painting and drawing and but also writing alongside it, of working women around Britain. And something affected me, and still does, is that Rita Pankhurst remembered that when Sylvia, when they packed up and they went to Addis Ababa later in life to live and to settle, that she took some new paintbrushes and paints, and she said, I intend to take up my brushes again, and I hope I'm going to be able to paint. And that was still with her in her 70s. And of course she didn't get around to the paint that, you know, Rita said to me that the brushes remained untouched, but the intention and was there. And I think she does write with an artist's eye. She most certainly does. And World War One, again, you know, the East London Federation of Suffragettes, and indeed how she ends up to be in East London, and has its own section. It's a 6-part book, and I dedicate a whole section to that. Again, with many omissions and you know, that I wish could otherwise be there, but it's a fairly substantial and long section. But I think for me, what I found very interesting is that she gets to East London via America, and that, you know, but that was really became clear to me through, you know, engaging with the you know, the garment workers' strikes, the activism and what was happening in America, not just in the women's suffrage movement and the way that the American feminist women were a bit different to what she was used to in Britain, but actually her engagement with working women and unions and socialism in America. And so there's very much a feeling that when she comes back, she's moving on from Keir Hardie, but she's also, she moves to the East End of London, and from then she never moves back, if you like, sort of either emotionally or politically to the West, which might be, or the centre, which might be more sort of associated with a sort of more bourgeois background. And from there she goes to Africa, and the rest is history.
There's there's 2 more questions though. Kevin asks, what was Sylvia's opinion about Emily Hobhouse? And there's another question, I can't remember who it's from actually, but somebody who wants to know more about, this is another, Sylvia's relationship with her mother and her sister. Well, where do we start? Start with Emily Hobhouse, exactly, yeah.
Thank you so much for the Emily Hobhouse question, because wow, what a great person she was. If you're thinking of writing a book about her, do, because there's you know, there's another one, there are more to be done. They met each other actually at the McDonald's, at Ramsey McDonald's, sort of at home parties. And actually Hobhouse had just come back from South Africa, and had been, you know, writing her exposés and her journalism, and they met and they had a chat about the politics of the time. And then at the end of it, I think Emily Hobhouse was interested in some patterns for lace making. It was sort of art, sort of, you know, art and craft sort of type question and so on. Indeed they certainly stayed in touch, because when socialist European socialist women were organising to protest against the First World War, Emily Hobhouse then, you know, reappears very much in Sylvia's life, and as with many of her other friendships and associations, there are things, you know, one would really like to be able to explore them further. But yes, if you're interested in Hobhouse, they knew each other politically, they worked together politically, but they also socialized.
Do you want to say anything about?
Oh, what? Yeah, I mean, forgive me. I mean, it's a lot of, yeah. I mean, Mary chuckles because if you have the opportunity to read the book, the question of her relationship with her mother and her sister is absolutely central, and certainly very defining of the first half of the book, as it was her life. But I would say something, and this does actually pertain to, we're not going to mention the dubious biographer, but I think that something that is quite important is that there's no sort of reduction to a sort of flight to psychoanalytic interiority, and that's not because I'm anti-psychoanalysis. It's not because I don't believe the unconscious doesn't exist. It's not because I don't think that that sort of stuff is interesting. But what I do think is very important, and that we need to put back into that narrative, and particularly back into, or that we need to maintain, not put back into the feminist narratives, is that there are all sorts of currents and there are all sorts of things going on, but this is not a sort of a Bloomsbury set nursery hothouse drama about why one sister is jealous of another or whatever thing. There are elements of that, but they're freedom. These are political differences. This is a civil war in a family where they fell out because they believed fundamentally different things. And if I'm going to put it, the bottom line is that, and for Sylvia, is that they all started out as socialists. Let's remember that Emmeline Pankhurst met Keir Hardie with her husband, when they were at the International in Paris, and again in London. She started out as a socialist, as did with her husband, and as indeed did Christabel. They moved away from that position, and they became literally conservative. And Emmeline Pankhurst stood unsuccessfully for Whitechapel as a conservative, as a Tory MP. So the fight between them is for me, and it's what Barbara Castle says, and I think she puts it, and I should have remembered this at the beginning because I could have answered your question much more succinctly at this stage, but Barbara Castle said in the 1980s, the bitter rift between the Pankhurst sisters, and I think within that one can imply the mother because Emmeline sided with Christabel, would come to represent the two strands of the development of feminism. And at the time that Castle wrote this, the Conservative Margaret Thatcher, Britain's first female Prime Minister, the self-proclaimed anti-feminist, had just been re-elected for a third successive term. And for me, that is really interesting. And I think it relates very importantly to the undermining and the rolling back of political feminism through this neoliberal individualist feminism that has so much taken a grip post 1970s. And I think that you can see for me that the fault lines that we live and experience and grapple with between, for want of a better term, sort of bourgeois individualist apolitical feminism and socialist feminism tied to a much broader egalitarian agenda is in this family, and that makes it interesting. So it becomes a paradigm for understanding that more broadly. Lots of hand waving going on.
I couldn't agree with you more. This is exactly why many years ago I was uncomfortable with the history of the so-called suffragette movement, which was only sort of, if you probably won't remember this, but there was a television program that was basically said that the women's votes were achieved because of the individual acts of heroism of individual women who and I thought, that's not right, that doesn't work. Mass movements are the thing. And then I realized that in this one family, it's exactly what Barbara Castle said. There's the microcosm of the split between, it's a political split. And in a way, by betraying socialism, they also betrayed women, because the war came about and stopped the fight for the right to vote. All out.
They sold out.
they sold out completely. So I think you're absolutely right, and it is the same problem that is afflicting us today. Please, la change. But I don't think there's any more questions. But I want to say that I think the book really is wonderful, and I was very dubious about it to start with, just because of the nature of biography. And I thought, well, how do you know what people thought? How do you know, and why should you, dig into their pride? That's why I never wanted to write a biography. You've convinced me that a good biography can be written. You say early on in the book, I think this is the quote, childhood has, from you, childhood has in common with biography and history that it's often a story told by others about ourselves. And I like the fact that you said earlier on that you weren't completely convinced about writing biography, but you've written two now. And I think that you have not, the personal stuff that you've put in is actually relevant to all the political stuff. At least it all kind of gels. That's how I found it, which is why I think it was a terrific book. And I was very, very, as I said before, didn't think I was going to enjoy this at all. I just didn't want to know what you thought she felt. Because lots of biographies are like that. They're actually projections of the of the author.
Well, write a novel if you feel like that. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. But you see, this is my big accolade for you. You wrote this as a historian. You really, really, I think, and this is the great credit to you with your zillions of footnotes, endnotes, I should say. You looked at the sources, and I've very, very rigorously, and I absolutely commend you for that, because this is a work of scholarship, real scholarship, and I was no, it's not.
Thank you.
It's actually true. I mean, that's why it stands. It will stand the test. I just wish you'd mentioned more about the statue campaign, but apart from that, everything was terrific. But it exemplified the historian's craft, and I think that's a tremendous credit, and that's why this book will stand the test of time. As others, there have been others that have written, it's just rubbish, absolute nonsense. I mentioned one of them, but the Roger Fulford book, all of these things we can do without. This, I think, is a very important book, and I think that you make a good case for saying that somehow or other that there should be a collection of her works. I have to say that I don't find her poetry I just don't like her poetry at all. I just even, but I know she wrote a lot, but I could do without that. Let's have the books at any rate. But you make a case, I think, for her as a travel writer. When you look, I mean, the north of England, Russia, Soviet Russia included, America, Romania, Ethiopia. I mean, where didn't the woman go? And she wrote about it and drew about it. I mean, incredible stuff. Just checking that there isn't one more question. No, I think there isn't actually. So I would like you, Rachel, to give you the final word, really, because just to say, in however you want to say it, why you think it's important that we should know about the life and work of Sylvia Pankhurst.
Well, thank you very, very much for that, Mary, and thank you everyone for joining and to remember Sylvia this evening. I think we need to urgently have very sharply in focus at the moment the necessity to defend and actively defend our rights and freedoms, and there are many different reasons that I think that Sylvia is an important, enjoyable, and interesting companion at the moment. It might be a journey through her art, it might be a journey through other aspects for her, but very, very crucially in this moment of hard men, strong men, tin pot dictators, and the attempt to dismantle what's been 100 years of parliamentary democracy, the rise of the right, and fascism. And we all remember, I'm sure, that not amongst us in this particular audience, but more broadly, that there might have been a little bit of a sucking of teeth, or a little bit of, you know, don't call Donald Trump a fascist. I mean, that's a bit, you know, before 20, that's a bit strong. And I remember sort of thinking, you know, looking at the press around the I mean, don't need to mention what the storming of the Capitol will, you know, that stands there. But even before that, the way that the acceptance of what we're really dealing with here has moved into sort of mainstream discourse, and I fear that for all the wrong reasons, in terms of you know, the consequences of austerity, you know, the care crisis, the land grab, you know, and we only need to see it in this you know, the disastrous management. There's absolutely no reason why we, you know, that as the 5th wealthiest nation in the world, that it is completely inexcusable that we should be in this shit show of a mess that we are, which is a combination of Brexit, dog's breakfast. That's an insult to dogs, but you know, the combination of Brexit and which indeed deploy to hide behind the mismanagement of the pandemic. And I also hold the leadership and front bench of the Labour Party to account for being supine and inadequate in their response to dealing with the government at the moment, though it hurts me to say it. And so I'd like to end on a more upbeat note, but I think that Sylvia Pankhurst is really important to us, and her handbook of activism is very useful. But she's important for all the wrong reasons, because of these issues which are and experiences that we're going through at the absolute forefront of where we are now.
Rachel, we can't go on agreeing all the time. Anyway, look, this was terrific, and everybody's going to buy this book. It's a shame it costs £35, but is it coming out in paperback?
Yes, and it is. So it is a shame it costs £35, and it's also a shame that it is, as we discussed earlier, way too heavy to read in bed, or indeed standing up. The paperback will be coming out in September, and will be cheaper and lighter.
Right. I'm going to close by saying that there are 3 members of the Sylvia Pankhurst Memorial Committee here tonight. One of them's me, and there's Megan and Philippa here. So we hope that when the statue is going to be erected on Clerkenwell Green, based on obviously upscaling of the maquette in LML, Rachel, you will come and help us unveil it. You'll be there, I'm sure, and maybe that will be the time to make an announcement that you're now raising funds for a collection of the collected works of Sylvia Pankhurst. We should that be the next campaign. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, at least a selected, and we do. I do mention the statue campaign in the afterword to the book, but I'm sure that we can have a word and beef that up when I'm doing the corrections for the paperback. And put a little bit of updated information, because I know that you're that much closer now and so on. But thank you very, very much indeed.
You can have a picture of the maquette. Look, Rachel Holmes, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Marion.
A wonderful book, a wonderful talk, and you're a credit to your craft. Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for attending. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as we did. I think we did, didn't we, Rachel? Yeah, we did.
Thank you Thank you, Marion.
Rachel, wait a minute. Okay, bye-bye, everybody, except for Rachel. I've just got to